We are going to briefly talk about cybersecurity in healthcare in this conversation. It is unfortunately a topic that is going to be something every healthcare administrator has to deal with on two fronts. One is the security rule within HIPAA, and the second is that every organization is going to suffer a breach of some kind that's going to have to be dealt with. So first we'll take up the security rule of HIPAA. We'll also talk about managing a breach. Let's talk about the security rule under HIPAA. It was first released in February of 2003. It applies only to electronic data. Um, it is a fluid rule in that it requires that every organization do a risk assessment of what are their vulnerabilities, what are reasonable remedies for those. It requires that you know, basically the organization comply with the standard practices for an organization of their size. And that, of course, is always open to challenge as to what exactly that means, because a two-person physician's office is going to have a whole different situation than a healthcare system that has 200 hospitals scattered around the world. So it is intended to be a scalable sort of regulation, but it is fairly onerous. It requires IT sophistication. It appreciates that every organization is different. It also appreciates that to implement the IT standards of a multinational organization is simply not usually feasible for a local healthcare provider running a solo shop. So it has to be balanced with business decisions within the organization. It also has to look at the reasonable alternatives within the reach of that organization. So one has to do the analysis looking at the administrative safeguards, that is training people, um, uh, determining who has access to the system or what parts of the system that person would have access to. Um, it looks at physical safeguards, and that is things as simple as where are your monitor screens located? Can passerbys see those screens? Um, how does one physically access the system? Passwords, or um, is there a place where people can view that data in a careful location? And the third, of course, is the technical safeguards. That is where you get into how strong are the passwords, what are your firewalls within the EMR or your system in general, to Chinese wall people to keep them within the bounds of where they want to be. How do you keep out outside third parties? Um, all the other things that go into IT these days. The last part of it is to look at the organizational requirements of how does this organization operate, and where is access being granted, not granted to outside organizations, and what's being done to protect the PHI in your organization. Last but not least, everything in HIPAA is a matter of documentation, and so all policies and procedures have to be documented about what the training is on cybersecurity for your employees, what are the steps that are being taken for cybersecurity within your organization, how do you manage infractions, and so forth. Let's shift gears entirely and talk a little bit about managing a breach. Every healthcare organization is going to have one, and it may be one a week, maybe one a day, depending on what the size of your organization is. And that may be a breach as big as Yahoo having all of its data hacked for 3 million users, or it may simply be the ER nurse wants to check up on her former husband. Both of those are considered to be a breach under the regulations. Once one looks at it, we then look at whether a breach has occurred. Breach is defined as using this definition. In essence, is any improper accessing or divulging of information from your system. What are the exceptions? Well, there may be inadvertent disclosure to someone else in your organization. You may be talking about a patient and the CEO walks by. That's not a breach of information. There may be a disclosure within the organization in a very similar sort of circumstance to another authorized individual. It doesn't matter. It may be that two physicians are talking about a patient and a third physician walks by. No problem. It was the third situation is where this information may have been kind of put out there in the ether, but nobody captured it. There may have been a gap in your firewall for 5 minutes, but nobody went through the firewall, so there was no problem. It may be that there was some information that two nurses were talking about, but nobody heard it. Kind of if a tree falls in the forest and nobody's there, doesn't make a sound, sort of phenomena. If you determine that a breach has occurred, then you have to go through the kind of further analysis as to the probability of whether or not the PHI has been compromised. And you look at a risk assessment and you look at several factors. One is the burden on the healthcare provider, and the second is if you contend that there was a low probability of compromise, then you have to document that process. That investigation has to include a number of things, such as what type of identifiers were within the information that was disclosed or hacked, and what's the likelihood of the identifiers being put back with the information so that an individual patient could be identified. Would an unauthorized person be able to figure that out? And was it ever used in any sort of malevolent or other manner going forward? What did you do to mitigate the risk of any use of that information? This is a table that was developed by the feds, and it is very useful to work through what happens in a breach. And I'll also post this on the website so you can look at it in more detail. But it will work through if you have a breach, who do you have to notify and when in the process. It may be that the police ask you to not immediately notify the public or the individual patients that there has been a breach. They can do that orally, and you may be working with the FBI or Secret Service or NSA, depending on your organization. They may say, look, let's keep this quiet. We want to track what's going on, and they can do that. You can do that on their oral commitment for 30 days. You better document someplace that you did that, because as you know from the press, not divulging that tends to get second guessed later. It may be that you are asked to maintain that confidentiality of the police for longer than 30 days, and if so, then that needs to be written down as a letter from the law enforcement agency. This brings us to the end of our conversation about cybersecurity. I appreciate that it is just touching the surface of this complicated area. What I would recommend any healthcare organization to do is to anticipate that you will have cybersecurity breaches, that you should be doing tabletop exercises or other drills to anticipate what to do when that occurs, whether that is ransomware, whether that is a hack, whether that is a staff member who is inappropriately accessed information, whatever, to anticipate that, practice it, be ready to address it when it does occur, because it's not a matter of if, it's a matter of when in this area. And with that, I hope you have a great day.